When Tyndale took his Greek translation of Isocrates to London to show it to Bishop Tunstall and was snubbed, he stayed in London for a year, staying with a merchant called Monmouth, Henry Monmouth, and also preaching in London. We know the church at which he preached, and we know that a lot of people heard him. But he realized, having hung about in London trying to get permission, he realized, as he said later, there was no place in all England where he could do this work. So with Monmouth's money helping him, Monmouth was a rich merchant, he went over to Germany, which was a very sensible idea.
And he believes in that so passionately, he's prepared to, completely wreck his life. You know, he becomes a fugitive, he becomes an outlaw, he has to live a long way away from people that he loves. He's often working in danger, so he's a bit of an adventurer, really.
Tyndale, as he left England with Monmouth's support, was breaking the law, and both of them knew it, because it was illegal in England to translate any part of the Bible into English. When Tyndale was crossing the sea to go to Germany, just at that time we know of a young man in Norwich, a city north of London, was burned alive for having in his possession a small piece of paper on which was written the Lord's Prayer in English. Now Tyndale knew that he was going to Germany and was not out of range of King Henry or Wolsey or Bishop Tunstall even. He was taking a risk. He knew that he would probably never see England again. Because while Henry was alive and while Wolsey was powerful and others around him in the court, as soon as he stepped back into England, he'd be arrested and burned. In 1500, that is a long time ago, there were in Europe that we know 1,000 printers. We know them by name. England had 2, and they were neither of them any good. So for Tyndale to go abroad to Germany, to a printing house in Germany, it was very sensible. 1, because it would be good printing. 2, because the resultant book would be widely circulated. So he settled in Cologne at a very famous printing shop, with a man called Peter Quentel, and began to print the Greek New Testament in English, the work he'd been doing at Little Sodbury.
Printing in the 1500s was very different from the way we print today. Printers used small pieces of metal on which they had engraved single letters of the alphabet. These could then be arranged and rearranged on large wooden blocks to form words and sentences. The letters were dabbed with ink, and then a single sheet of paper was placed over them and clamped down to make the imprint of words. It was a very tedious and slow process, but much quicker than the way books were duplicated before the invention of the printing press, which was to write each page by hand.
Printing in Europe could be very good. You could produce a very beautiful book on beautiful paper with beautiful type and beautifully bound. Most of the time the printing was just ordinary and unbound. If you bought a book, you bought it without a binding. You just bought the loose leaves and then got it bound yourself. Printing could be very quick and very successful and very accurate. Peter Quentel was printing powerful Catholic documents and also printing things like the New Testament and comments on them, which were forbidden in England. But it was a little looser in Germany and in Belgium, and there was more freedom. Peter Quentel was not quite breaking the law, but he would have known that had Tyndale finished his New Testament, it would have been smuggled into England. But on the other hand, printers are not fools. I mean, he wouldn't set up what was going to be a very beautiful book without knowing it was going to be bought, and he was going to make a lot of money out of it. There were thousands upon thousands of people in England waiting to receive it, to buy it.
To be honest with you, I bet Tyndale wasn't even aware of how rough his life was, because he was thrilled on that day when the printing press went down and he saw it for the first time, or when he saw the first bound edition, or when he saw the ship going off full of those books that thousands of people would read and have their lives changed. That's what he was aware of. He wasn't aware of, oh, flippin' heck, I'm feeling a bit lonely or hungry today, or, you know, that kind of passion informs you, not the inconveniences of your life.
Tyndale got as far as nearly the end of Matthew's Gospel, which is about a 20th part of the whole New Testament, when the print shop was raided. This was because a rather nasty man who went under the Latin name of Cochlaeus, who was violently against Martin Luther and wrote enormous amounts against Martin Luther, discovered that Quentel was printing a New Testament in English. The story goes that he got the printers drunk. And when they were drunk, they said, you know, there's a book being printed which is going to change England. So Cochlaeus told Henry's court. Henry's court got back to Cologne, and the Cologne authorities were persuaded to raid the shop. Luckily, he gets warning that Cochlaeus's raid on Quentel's print shop is coming, and he and his helper, a man called William Roy, managed to take the manuscript and the few leaves they printed with them and sail in a boat up the River Rhine to a city which was safe for them, a city called Worms.
We can only imagine the difficulty in which Tyndale was working up to this point. Surely it was satisfying work. He was seeing his vision coming to a reality. At the same time, this had come with a price. After the raid on Peter Quintal's print shop, Tyndale was forced to flee and began to live life as a fugitive. If things were difficult prior to this incident, they became more so afterwards. Without a doubt, it must have been difficult to know he was being pursued by the authorities when his only intentions were to bring God's word to his people.
And 6,000 were printed, which is a lot for a book of that time, smuggled down the Rhine across to England, to the English seaports and the Scottish seaports as well to the north, and eagerly received. They were so eagerly received that Tunstall heard of this and set up, as it were, his police to raid the Christians who were buying these and to seize them and to punish the owners, sometimes with death. And he arranged in London a large bonfire of Tyndale's 1526, which is the date he made it, first English New Testament. Now, when we hold our modern Bibles, we have to remember that the English, to have a Bible in English in your hand, is less than 500 years old. You could only do that thanks to Tyndale in 1526. We have to remember that it was a small book. It was this size. It was a book that you could not only hold in your hand, but slip into your pocket, so that you could take it into the fields, you could read it round the hearth, you could read it in the pub, as people did, you could read it in the backs of churches, as people did. We always have to remember this, because we're used to Bibles being bigger. But Tyndale, every book that Tyndale printed, and he printed many, were all pocketbooks.
The people in England were eager to read God's word in English. Every book that was secretly brought into England quickly found its way into the hands and homes of sincere Christians.
There was already a network of Christians who were eagerly awaiting them. Now, these are the people who had heard that there was a printed New Testament from the Greek coming into England, and they would be alert, and the network would be alerted. And within 8 years, we know that 20,000 copies of it were printed and bought in England. This was in spite of the fact that the Bishop of London originally collected as many as he could find and punished the owners and made a great bonfire outside St. Paul's Cathedral and burned them all. Now, this is a terrible thing, to burn God's word. But he also preached a sermon while the burning was going on, in which he said that this was heresy. The church refused it because there were 2,000 errors in Tyndale's translation. Well, of course there were, from Tunstall's point of view, because Tyndale was translating from the Greek, not from the church's Latin. Tyndale later said that the church was so determined to make him a heretic that if he failed to dot an I, they would call that heresy and burn him. Hearing in Germany of the burning of his books and the hostility, Tyndale didn't give up as a lesser man would. What he did was do something that was completely strange in England. He learned the Hebrew language. The Old Testament, which we Christians call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, are written in Hebrew. But Worms, as it happened, was a center of rabbinical learning. And Tyndale learned there Hebrew, very good Hebrew. And he went from Worms to Antwerp on the coast, the Belgian coast, a very thriving seaport that was full of printers. And there he printed the first ever translations from Hebrew into English, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. The first 5 books of Moses, and these were also smuggled across in larger numbers. Tyndale then went on, as well as writing other books, he then went on to revise his 1526. This he published in Antwerp very well in 1534, and many, many of these were smuggled into England and were more successful, and few of them were destroyed. And one of them actually came to Henry's court and was proudly owned by a young woman who became Henry's second queen, Anne Boleyn. And this is a remarkable volume which the British Library now holds. I've held it in my hands. And round the foredge is written in Latin that it's owned by Anne Boleyn, Queen. It's a wonderful document. And she was sympathetic to Tyndale and what he was doing. King Henry, knowing of Tyndale's books, his New Testament translations, his Old Testament translation, his other books, realized that this was a man who was going to have more influence even in England than he was having. He therefore thought it would be a good idea if Tyndale became part of his own court, where he could be controlled.